Good evening, everyone. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we will pick up in verse 21. 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 21. We stopped and we were right in the middle of this section of verses dealing with the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of men, the wisdom of human philosophy and so forth, Greek rhetoric and things like that. That would have been of the day, the philosophers of the day and so forth. And so that's part of this conversation that's taking place, and he talks about the preaching of the message, the preaching of the word, the preaching of the gospel. That's what God has given to mankind. It is that particular message of the cross, the preaching of the cross, that is seen in the wisdom of God. And as we were walking through the last couple of verses, we started kind of building out this chart, if you will. To those who are perishing, it seems foolish. Those who are caught up in human wisdom, that they believe that's what's going to save them, the philosophy of the day, and we're going to talk more and more a little bit about that as we go on into even chapter 2. That's part of this section that we're dealing with, and this comparison between human wisdom and the wisdom of God, divine wisdom. But you see on that left-hand side of that chart, this would include both the intelligence of learned ones, whether it be the Jews or the Greeks. And so, and we'll see that especially here in verse 22 here in a moment. There's a reference to Isaiah talking about where's the scribe, where is the wise ones of the day, where's the disputer of this world, the one who was basically able to debate as such with the back and forth with these philosophies and so forth. And even going back to the wise men of the day, when it came to time dealing with Sennacherib and so forth, they were told that they should not, in fact, make these leagues with other nations around them. Well, Paul takes that bit of Israelite history, brings it forward in time, and says, here we are again. Here's the situation. And if you're staking your claim on human wisdom and philosophy, you're going to perish. And you may see it as foolishness, and that's maybe how you perceive it. But in fact, to those who are being saved, it's the power of God. And so that's the comparison through these through this last couple of verses, especially in verse 22. Well, let's just back up. He says, since in the wisdom of God, verse 21, the world through wisdom did not know God. And so through that human wisdom, the world doesn't even know God. And if you kind of peek ahead into chapter 2, part of that conversation is the fact that wisdom ultimately is not going to teach them about God. They're going to need to know from God directly in order to know what God's thinking, in order to know how to be saved, which is really from about verse 8 to the end of the chapter. That's what is being talked about. He's talking about the revelation that has come directly from God. And so that divine wisdom, that versus human wisdom. And so, again, you can think about a passage like Jeremiah 10, verse 23. O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It's not in man that walketh to direct his own steps. In other words, he cannot find God through his own wisdom. And so through, again, the philosophies of the day, if you're talking about the Greeks, if you're looking at the Jewish leaders of the day and their learned wisdom, they had the prophecies, right? And still would miss the Christ somehow. And unfortunate as it is. And so he says in verse 22, the Jews require a sign. They're always seeking after a sign. They want to see some kind of sign. And we talked about this first part of this, that they always wanted these signs. And let's just look at a couple of these passages. Matthew 12, verse 31, or 38 rather. Matthew 12:38. Some of the scribes and Pharisees answered, saying, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." In other words, Rabbi. They recognizing him, by the way, as a rabbi, as a teacher of the Jews in this way. We want to see a sign. Show us something. Then just think ahead to a conversation that takes place a little bit later. In John chapter 14, you have Thomas, right? Who also wants to show us the Father, in fact. That'll suffice us, right? That'll be enough. Show us the Father. What does Jesus tell him? Or what is he asking? And he says, doesn't he say, if I've been with you all of this time, haven't you seen the Father? If you've seen me, so he goes on to answer it, if you've seen me, then you have seen the Father, as Ms. Shirley points out. That was the point that he'd made. So he's showing them this is literally divine wisdom. This is the Logos from God. This is the Word directly from God, the one who is standing right before them, right? Going back to John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, the one who created, the one who has shone and brought light into the world. And so the Jews request a sign. Just jump over to chapter 16 of Matthew. Matthew 16, verse 1. The Pharisees and the Sadducees came, testing him, that he would show a sign from heaven. Show us a sign. What had the work of Jesus been characterized by, marked by, if you will? I'll use that word, marked by. Signs. What kind of signs? Miracles. What kind of miracles? Huh? Wonders. Miracles, wonders, and signs. All right, we got the words out of the way. What was he doing? What did that look like to people? Healing. Raising from the dead, right? He's done these miraculous things. He's turned water to wine. He has brought forth from the dead. He has done all kinds of signs in front of them. Show us a sign, right? Show us a sign. And I like the conversation that takes place in John chapter 9 with the man who was born blind, you remember? Later when the Pharisees, when they're questioning him, it's all right, now tell us again what happened. Why, are you going to believe him? They're not going to believe it, are they? He's going to go through it again. He's been made to be able to see, and he's standing before them, and he's telling them, and says, okay, now tell us again what happened. Why, are you going to believe him? And that was the point. They wouldn't believe him. They were requiring a sign. They wanted to see signs. And you could go on, again, John chapter 2, just after the wedding feast in Cana, they're asking for signs right off the bat. The Greeks seek after wisdom. The Greeks seek after wisdom. Worldly wisdom and philosophy. Failing to recognize that perfected wisdom would come from above. Notice Colossians chapter 2. Colossians 2, verse 8. Paul writing to them, and really in talking a great deal about, if you go back to verse 7, being rooted and built up in Him and established in the faith. That's what he was praying for them. That's what he was wanting for them. As you have been taught, abounding in it with thanksgiving. You've been taught. You've been taught the Scriptures. You've been taught the divine wisdom from above, right? So beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy vain deceit or empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ. Human philosophies, in other words. Those who have come along, and you remember when Paul was in Athens, at Areopagus, at Mars Hill, and there were those who were gathered who were basically just there wanting to listen to some new person get up and tell us something new, right? And they even talked about Paul. They've heard some of what he said. Well, you get on up here and you teach us. He seems to be sort of like a seed picker was the word that they used to describe him. In other words, it's like you've got a little bit of this and a little bit of this and a little bit of this, and so you just tell us what it is. And he preached about the resurrection, and they said, well, we'll hear that later. We're going to put that off. We don't want to hear that at all. And some just flat mocked him, right? But there were a few who believed because of the teaching that Paul did there. But there were those Greeks who were just gathered there for that very purpose, just to hear some new thing taught to them. And so you get a picture of kind of the day and these philosophies and the philosophers of the day. And so, and by the way, each one of them trying to outdo the next. And what's interesting is when you go back to 1 Corinthians and you take a peek at verse 1 of the next chapter, chapter 2, verse 1, what does Paul say? When I came to you, I didn't come with what? With excellence of speech. That's a direct hit, if you will, from Paul to the Greek philosophers of the day. I didn't come with this flowery speech to try to draw you after me. Remember, what's the point? What's the point that he's talking about? They were divided up, right? The one's following Apollos, one's following Paul, and another one's following Cephas, right? And he's saying, I am of Christ, and I don't want to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and Him crucified. That's what the message was about. That divine message, that was the only saving message that needed to be heard. That was the message of the day. And Paul says, that's what I'm going to preach. That's what is going to draw men to Jesus. That's what's going to save mankind. Others are going to see it as foolish, and it'll be to their detriment. They're going to perish because of it. And so this is this back and forth. Of course, James chapter 3, James would talk about that wisdom, and he would also make a comparison to it. The wisdom of the world is sensual, it's devilish, clearly not from God. Not from God. If it is the wisdom that is from God, that is first peaceful, peaceable. It brings peace to mankind. It doesn't separate, doesn't divide. But this that they've gotten caught up in has divided the church, right? And so it clearly is not from God, but rather from the devil. Verse 23, but we preach Christ crucified. To the Jews see it as a stumbling block. And to the Greeks, it's foolishness. And he's covered that again. This is the message of the cross, going back to verse 18. And to the Jews, they saw this as revolting. You mean to tell me that the Messiah that all the prophets have told about, that He is going to be that Jesus is the one? He was hung with the criminals. He was hung on a cross. Cursed is everyone who's hung on a cross, right? And so it's revolting to them. They can't get beyond that in their mind. To the Greeks, they just see, so you're saying your Savior is the one who died just a little while back up on that cross, right? That's the one that you're following? And they just see it as, that's just foolish. That can't be. Where's the power in that? Where's the wisdom in that? That can't possibly be your Savior. But to those who are called, he says, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God, and the very wisdom of God. It's the question, who are the called? Who are the called? Okay, those who have accepted the message of the cross, because they've been called by that message, right? That's what Paul would say. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. Those who were called, he says, by my gospel, by my preaching of the cross, by my preaching of the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Those are the called ones. And so how were they called? Called by the gospel. And so regardless, here's what's amazing. Here's what's beautiful about the Lord's church. Here's what's beautiful about this message. It doesn't matter about what nation you're a part of. It doesn't matter your race. Those who listen to and heed God's message will be saved. And their backgrounds didn't matter anymore. Romans 1:16, right? The cross, the gospel, the power of God unto salvation. To who? To everyone, right? To everyone who believes that message. And in believing, obviously, believing of that message has to do with heeding that message, doing what it says. God's wisdom leads to and through the Christ unto the Father. John chapter 6, verses 44 and 45. Yep.
You compared, I think earlier this course, you compared Corinth to Las Vegas. And Las Vegas is very much, it's a wild town, and there's the gambling and the shows and the fireworks and the fountains, and it's a big spectacle, and that's why people go there. And that's what Corinth was. They had the overt sexuality, they had idol worship, all of that going on. So it was a big spectacle kind of a town. And the people want their signs. They want their show of power. They want that excitement. Or somebody coming in, teaching them something that's new and exciting that they maybe haven't heard before. And so that's how they want the envelope pushed, is in sort of the excitement realm, the power realm. And now Paul has come along saying, we preach Christ crucified, which is as far away from, getting excited. It's your leader has died. I mean, it's a death on a cross, a humiliating death. Right. And so I can just see them listening to this message going, this isn't very exciting. This doesn't seem very powerful that we're rallying behind, a killed Savior. Of course, you get to the resurrection, that's a game changer. But I think they were after something completely different than what Paul was selling here. Yeah.
And that's why, especially that picture, I think, especially from Mars Hill, in that situation, you can almost see, as he's preaching that message, about the death, and then he gets to the resurrection. He even starts telling them about the resurrection, and they're going, at that moment, that's when they interrupt him, and basically you can almost see some of them in the crowd going, okay, right, and out the side door. Or off the hill, wherever they're headed. But anyway, you get the point. And so, yeah.
Human nature, people see where their eyes are pointed. I mean, it blows my mind that you could walk through the parted Red Sea and then a few days or weeks later be pulling off your own jewelry to make a cow. It blows my mind. But people are trying to follow their expectations or I guess that's not the best way to put it. They're looking to bring what they're hearing into their own expectations, and it was just a complete irony. I mean, we look back at Enoch trading his birthright for Sue as craziness, but at the same time, depending on what your perspective is and your expectation, it's a 180-degree shift and exactly the same thing looking back at us like we're crazy people.
Yeah. And I think that's part of the reason when Jesus comes on the scene, in his public ministry, the first sermon, on a large scale, he's been teaching a couple people, but first large sermon, if you will, is what we read the Sermon on the Mount. And in that, it was all about hopefully changing their expectation, right? And it was about trying to get them to think differently so that they could see. And what's interesting is that just shortly after that, we find Jesus and he's teaching in parables. And so much so that, what do these parables mean? Why are you teaching in parables? And you can imagine the conversation. You're the God that you're following, to the disciples, the guy that you're following, he's always got some kind of riddle, right? Some kind of, it would have been literally kind of a dark saying in that way. Dark in the sense that it had a hidden meaning to it. And not dark because it's evil, but dark just because it had that hidden meaning. They had to look for. They had to be seeking, right? And Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount had told them, ask, and it shall be given to you, right? Seek, and you will find. Knock, the door will be open. You're going to have to do some work, right, to see this and to experience this, the kingdom that is near, that is coming. You're going to have to be paying attention. It's here, it's at hand, it's right here, it's coming in your lifetime. Some of you are going to see it. You're going to see it come with the power from heaven directly. And so he's prepared them in every which way, even in how they would have perceived this. But you have to understand, this is not Jesus to that crowd there in Jerusalem. This is Paul in another country at this point in time. Yes, there's some Jews there, obviously. From this passage, we pick up on that. But it's a great deal of Gentiles in this congregation. So you've got a mixed bag. And you've got people that would already gladly not be happy with the guy sitting down the pew from them, right? Because he's a Jew. You got someone sitting on the other side, Jew sitting on the other side going, I've never liked that Gentile, and so, and then you have something tossed in the mix right here like this, where somebody comes along and says, I like old Peter. He's down to earth. He's easy to listen to, right? And someone says, Paul, man, he's learned. He was taught at the feet of Gamaliel, right? And so I like listening to him. He gets into it, right? He gets a little deeper than maybe everybody else. Apollos, he's eloquent and, his more beautiful speech, maybe, the way that he comes across. He's powerful and eloquent in his speech. And so you get that in the mix where people are saying, but I like this guy, I like this guy, I like this. And then all of a sudden it's just this division that's spread. And that's that partisan, sectarian, divisive spirit that has opened this letter, that's brought this letter on, that Paul is trying to deal with. And he's saying, if you're thinking like that, chapter 3, you're thinking like someone of the world. You're carnally minded. He says, and I'm going to have to talk to you like babes, like babies. And so he's dealing with this issue. But they're so caught up in this type of mentality. And so just remember the point here, God's wisdom, it leads to Christ and through Christ to God Himself. And that is the only way that salvation comes about. And he says, because
it all boils down to a matter of fact. People want to walk by sight and feeling rather than by faith.
Yeah, that's a good point.
They just can't comprehend the idea of faith in
Yeah.
Christ. We want to see it.
Yeah, we want to see it. Show it to me. I want to see it big, right?
It makes
Yeah.
us feel it here
Yeah.
at their heart.
That's a good point. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7. Walk by faith and not by sight. And so they definitely had that problem. And Paul's going to deal with that. And so he goes on then, because the foolishness of God, he says, wiser than men. You and I look at that and we go, duh, right? This is all part of that. And this is almost like a debate. What you're reading here is really are logical arguments that are being made. If this, then this. And because of this, then this. And so these logical debates, and Paul was good at this. And so he brings it back in. He says, because the foolishness of God is ultimately wiser than men, the weakness of God still stronger than man, right? There's truly no foolishness nor weakness in God. But he uses this for argument's sake. If there were any foolishness or weakness in God, then it's still greater than, better than, higher than man or his wisdom, right? That's the point that Paul is making. And I put Isaiah 55 verses 8 and 9 here. And I think and we use this often. We have to be careful about its context, but we use it often. My ways are higher than your ways, and so forth. This is God through Isaiah telling the people this. Ultimately, what he's telling them is, this could have been your ways. This could have been your way. Destruction was coming to them because it now wasn't their way. But he says, you could have followed me. And you remember numerous times through the Old Testament, you have this warning where God, through whatever prophet or through the lawgiver, would say, if you will do my commandments, keep my commandments, I will be to you a father, and you will be unto me as children, right? You'll be my children, my people. And so you get to Isaiah 55, there's judgment that is coming through the Assyrians and so forth. And this is coming because they had not chosen his ways. Yes, his ways are higher than and so forth. And that's the point here. The foolishness of God is wiser than men. And even the weakness, if there was weakness in God, it's still stronger than men. He says, for you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise, according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. He kind of lays it out here, doesn't he? I mean, all you got to do is kind of look around, he says. Not really pointing to a single individual here, but the group as a whole. He didn't say that there are not any that are called, that are wise and noble, but those who are following human wisdom. Those who believe that their power and authority that they have, maybe in a governmental position or whatever the case may be, those who are relying on that ultimately to save them and to keep them at a certain level, if you will, they're not called. They're not hearing that call. They're not listening to begin with. They're not listening even for a call. They're not looking. They're not seeking. They're not knocking. And so you have this thought. And of course, there are some exceptions that we see. But when you look at these individuals, when you read those passages and you look through this list, these are those in high positions. These are wise individuals. The treasurer of Queen Candace, the Ethiopian queen. This was the Ethiopian eunuch. Remember in Acts chapter 8? He's got a high position, right? And he's a pretty wise fellow. He's quite wealthy. He's got his own copy of the Word of God. He's got his own Isaiah scroll, which would have been a treasure in itself. Not everybody could get their hands on such. The proconsul of Crete, the judge of Athens, Dionysius, in Acts chapter 17, he's one who believed the Apostle Paul from Mars Hill, what was being preached there. The rulers of the synagogue in Corinth, Crispus and Sosthenes, these individuals clearly had obeyed the gospel. Women of nobility in both Thessalonica and even Berea are mentioned in Acts chapter 17. And so it's not saying that there were none that were called, that answered that call of the gospel. But he's saying as a group, typically speaking, those who have given themselves over to human wisdom or those places of power, he says that's not many of them are called. But God has chosen, he says, the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty. And so you think about the disciples. Typically speaking, most of them were of humble backgrounds, right, to begin with. And we think about the fishermen, right? You think about Peter, Andrew, James, and John. These were fishermen. They were probably, we would say today, check-to-check living or catch-to-catch living at that point in time. But these were humble men. And they're called out. They're seen in that way. Surprise, these men, these are unlearned and ignorant men. That's what the crowd said. But God is going to use foolish things of this world to put to shame the wise, and the weak things of this world to put to shame the things which seem mighty. You think about Stephen. He talks about the Jews not able to resist the wisdom by which he spoke. Stephen spoke, cost him his life, but still they were not able to resist what he said. They would resort to violence and kill him to shut him up. It seems probably only Matthew and Paul, as far as men of influence and education and power. The rest were of humble backgrounds. What are some other things that might be considered to be foolish, but God's power is seen manifested through them? Anything that you might think of?
The flip on humility, right? So the meek and the poor in spirit, the humble in nature, right? And how that flips and how, right? Using a weak vessel to showcase the power, because the power is not within the vessel, the power is within God.
That's right. And doesn't Paul talk about that? The weakness that he had, not just the frailty of his body, but the weakness in thinking about the temptations of life, right? And so Paul would talk about that, but he would use that. God would use that, showing him strength, showing him power. My grace is sufficient for you, right? And so he's able to even work through those things which basically made him feel weak and probably even look weak. And to some individuals, certainly Paul was weak. I just think about, just listing a couple things here, think about baptism itself. Think about singing. Just seems simple, right? But occasionally you'll hit one of those songs that'll get you. I know 2 or 3 on Cindy's list that every time they're led, I can expect what's going on right next to me, how she's feeling, because those songs I know get to her. And there are those that get to me that I, even as a song leader, I've been asked to lead before. And then there's some of them, God's Family, I'm not your song leader for that song, I just promise you that. Because I'm just going to leave you and everybody else is just going to have to keep singing. I'm going to go sit on the side and I'm going to bawl. That song gets me because that has a special meaning. So those words that we sing, even simple as they are, there's power in them, right? They affect us. They influence us. They help us be able to see truths. Think about just regular attendance. That seems simple in our minds, but the Hebrews writer would say in Hebrews 10, verse 23 and 24, long before he talks about not forsaking the assembling, he talks about that by our coming together that we can encourage one another, right? We can stir up one another. We can build up one another unto good works. That's part of our coming together. Well, that's just regular attendance. That seems simple. It's not really all that important to some people, but people are missed when they're not here, right? You miss your brothers and sisters when they're not at the table, right? You miss your family in that way. And so these are simple things, certainly the Lord's Supper and others we could just go on, but you kind of see the point in this. But we'll end here for the night, and appreciate everyone's attention. And you might think of some other things. And so if you do, we can bring those out, Lord willing, next week. Appreciate everyone's attention.